Americans across the country are hearing an eerily similar message.
Troubling trend of irresponsible one.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common.
In all these markets required.
Sinclair already owns more than 170 stations in 81 markets.
That is raising concerns because of Sinclair's policy of combining news with partisan political opinion.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Dozens of anchors, same script, millions of viewers, an Orwellian moment on the American airwaves. The perils of poverty porn, a British media trend demonizing the poor. The world's first law against fake news is passed in Malaysia. And
focus on the point in front of your eyes.
A digital Narendra Modi. The Indian Prime Minister strikes a slimmed-down yoga pose. We begin with a media company, a news organization, ordering its local television anchors across the United States to read from a script accusing other news outlets of trying to control, quote, what people think, unquote. A company that did that without a trace of irony. The Sinclair Broadcast Group is the biggest local television news network in the U.S., 173 stations. Now, Sinclair may not be a household corporate brand, or wasn't until this little episode, but it is influential, and it's trying to grow through a merger that would expand its reach to 70% of American homes. Now, getting that deal past the regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, probably won't be an issue. Sinclair has a friend in the White House, in Donald Trump, whose administration is currently binging on deregulation. Local television channels remain the primary news sources for millions of Americans, so there's a lot at stake here. Editorial balance, accuracy, and pluralism, the kinds of things that those journalists mentioned as they dutifully read off their autocues last week. Our starting point this week spread far and wide, local news outlets right across the United States of America.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
This is a textbook example of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts.
We work very hard to seek the truth and strive to be fair, balanced, and factual.
Seen individually, the Sinclair editorials do not make much of an impact. But when Timothy Burke, a video editor in Tampa, Florida, collected 44 versions of that editorial from 44 local news markets and lay them side by side, allowing Americans to play them back word for word.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
The effect was chilling.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Orwellian.
It was actually fairly horrifying. About a minute and a half op-ed decrying biased platforms pushing out fake news that endangered our democracy.
The sharing of biased
and false news has
become all too common on social media.
The anchors, for the most part, fairly stiff. A couple of people have compared them to hostage videos. So for a few seconds, it's actually kind of funny. And then you sort of tune into what they're saying, and it becomes more and more horrifying.
And whether the people understand exactly the politics and the conglomeration aspects that go into a message like this, these people, all they know is they saw a scary video where a bunch of news anchors were saying the same thing.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities.
And now their favorite news anchors are saying the same thing.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that ABC News 4 produces.
And they're just like, you're one of them.
When they learned that the Sinclair Broadcast Group was manipulating news content, the reaction of many Americans was, just what is Sinclair? Unlike Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC, Sinclair does not own a national news network, so its brand was not that well known. But it does own 173 local TV stations covering 40% of American households. Since those channels are affiliated with national broadcasting brands, ABC, NBC, and CBS, they display those logos rather than their parent companies. Up until now, Sinclair sent editorials from the company's headquarters in Maryland that their channels were required to broadcast.
My goal with every segment is to tell you facts which you may not already know.
Typically, the so-called must-runs are fronted by a Sinclair executive, Boris Epstein. He worked on Donald Trump's election team.
Some critics would have you believe that my experience somehow disqualifies me from providing you with my analysis and commentary.
This time, the company changed the formula and got its local anchors to deliver the message instead. It was caught and found itself in an unfamiliar position, in the spotlight.
If you wanted to come up with the perfect strategy for how to manipulate or warp the dialogue in America, you wouldn't buy one big cable channel or one big broadcast channel. No, if you were savvy about this, you would buy local affiliates in markets across the country. Get into every major city, every region to communicate a message. And then if you can put that message in the mouths of hundreds of local anchors who have been on air, in some cases for many, many years, that's a much better strategy for warping the discourse.
There's also something else worth mentioning. For all the attention CNN, MSNBC, Fox get, in fact, most Americans actually get their news, if they're watching television, from local news, not from the national networks, be they cable or broadcast.
The anchors, they are very well known in their communities. They tend to be active in charities. They show up for special events.
We are having an incredible night tonight. We are crushing cancer.
But they're also the people talking about things that you might have seen on your street. You might have seen, in the next town over. They're giving you the weather from your community.
The question now is, what do neighbors do about it?
And you've come to trust them over time. This is a reality of local news. It's how it works.
There's something particularly treacherous about taking these words from Sinclair's corporate headquarters and putting them in the mouths of journalists who are trusted to the point that now audiences can't tell whether or not the information they're consuming actually comes from these local journalists or if there's a giant conservative corporate Goliath pulling the strings.
And the Goliath wants to grow. Sinclair has a $3.9 billion merger deal in place with Tribune Media, which would land Sinclair another 42 local TV stations, including in major markets like New York, Chicago, and Washington, boosting its reach from 40% of American homes to more than 70%. The merger requires the approval of the FCC, the U.S. broadcast regulator. And given the FCC's recent track record since Donald Trump put Chairman Ajit Pai in the job last year, the regulator is not likely to stand in the company's way.
Ajit Pai was appointed as chair of the FCC by the Trump administration, and in less than a year he has absolutely gutted the remaining media ownership rules that the FCC had in place. And he has made it more possible for large broadcasters like Sinclair to buy up almost every media outlet in your community. All of that has been done specifically to grease the wheels for this merger between Sinclair and Tribune, which before Chairman Pai's chairmanship would have been absolutely impossible to approve because it violated so many of these FCC rules.
When the FCC was developed back in the 30s, the core concept was diverse ownership. You wanted a lot of different owners in a lot of different places. There was a vision of that goes back a very, very long way. This assaults that vision. It basically says, no. You have one little group of people sitting in an office someplace, and they decide what's being discussed all across the country.
Having been drawn out of the shadows, its heavy-handed editorial methods exposed and ridiculed, Sinclair has come out swinging. It responded to questions put to it by New York Magazine by saying that print media is so left-wing as to be meaningless, that it has no credibility. However, actions and broadcast output speak much louder than words. And when Sinclair put out another editorial this past week, it reverted to its old formula.
As you see, my segments are very clearly marked as commentary. The same cannot be said for cable and broadcast news hosts who inject their opinions and bias into news coverage all the time.
One talking head at head office delivering the corporate message, rather than relying on Sinclair's local anchors and what remains of their credibility.
That's one of the things I think that Sinclair is going to have to deal with. So many people have been exposed to this video that they have to be able to explain to that audience why their local news is still trustworthy. Are they going to attempt to repair what has been a massive damage to their image? Are they going to pull back from interfering in their newsrooms on a daily basis? I don't know.
What's happened with Sinclair is actually really good. It's great that we have seen this thing happen with all the anchors reading the same lines across the country, because we've had a real life example of what we should be afraid of.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Will Young. Will, fake news. Many countries have threatened to criminalize it. Malaysia is actually doing that. What steps is it taking?
Yes, Malaysia has now passed the world's first law against fake news. Both houses of parliament ratified the law this past week. Now it just needs the signature of the Sultan, but that's considered a formality. The definition of fake news here is really very broad and vague. Any news, information, data and reports which are wholly or partly false, whether in the form of features, visuals, audio recordings, or in any other form capable of suggesting words or ideas. And the penalties are really harsh, up to $123,000 in fines and maximum jail terms of 6 years. That would seem to include individuals who spread or share stories, not just those who create them, as well as the online platforms they appear on.
All of which begs the question, how will fake news be identified and who will be doing the identifying?
Right, we don't have any clear indications, but it would seem to come down to the government of the day. Last month, Malaysia's Deputy Communications Minister said that any unverified information relating to one story in particular, the 1MDB scandal, would be considered fake news. Now, 1MDB is a government-owned strategic development company from which Prime Minister Najib Razak has been accused of siphoning billions of dollars into his personal bank account. Malaysia's opposition parties oppose this law. They say it's an attempt to stifle freedom of speech in the run-up to a general election, which could be held as early as next month.
You've also been following a kidnap case in Ecuador, 2 journalists taken along with their driver near the border with Colombia. What's the story there?
Yes, they were abducted late last month in the northern region of Esmeraldas, and a hostage video has now surfaced on the Colombian TV network RCN. It shows reporter Javier Ortega Reyes, photographer Paul Rivas Bravo, and their driver Efraín Segarra Abri, all of them employees of Ecuador's El Comercio newspaper. The hostages confirm they were taken by the Oliver Sinistera Front, which is a splinter group from FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Now, FARC laid down its weapons as part of the peace agreement in 2016, but the Oliver Sinistera Front refuses to do that. Now, the group is demanding an end to anti-narcotics cooperation between the Colombian and Ecuadorian governments, as well as the release of 3 imprisoned combatants who were not identified.
And these journalists would have known that the story that they were covering came with risks, right?
Yes, the north of Esmeraldas, which borders Colombia, is one of Ecuador's poorest regions, and criminal gangs operate pretty freely there. The El Comercio team was reporting on the surge in violence since a bomb went off at a police station in January. Since then, there have been 5 other attacks, indicating that violence is spilling over from southern Colombia.
Okay, thanks, Will. On to a story about a different genre of media now, one that's come to be known in the UK as poverty porn. Take what the British call a benefit scrounger, someone who's apparently milking the state's welfare system for all it's worth, throw in a dash of stereotyping, a little demonizing, then add an element of reality TV celebrity culture, and presto, you have a television program. Some might find that to be an odd formula. However, British tabloids and TV channels have long been hooked on stories about people claiming money from the state. Among the problems associated with poverty porn, these shows and provocative news articles might entertain audiences, but they don't inform them. And turning welfare recipients into caricatures could have implications for the welfare system and the people who depend on it. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on the British media's obsession with benefits, the myths and the money-making industry that has created.
Benefits Britain has never been bigger.
The single mum with lots of kids.
4-bedroom house, 4 children, 4 different fathers.
The alcoholic drinking away his dole money.
Drink as a skunk. It's not Christmas.
The immigrant sponging off the state.
It's very, very easy to take a benefit in England.
The cheat, the swindler.
The cheats who claim off the state, but still rake in a secret salary.
Whether Channel 4's benefits Street, Channel 5's benefits Britain, headlines in The Sun or the Daily Express. When it comes to stories about welfare recipients, the British media rely on a cast of cliché characters they recycle over and over.
Those narratives and those kind of images create and sustain divisions between deserving and undeserving populations, so between kind of workers and shirkers, between welfare dependents and hardworking families. The whole setup of these programmes is around there being like a them and us.
You're telling everybody in this studio, and you're telling everybody who's watching right now, that we're mugs, that we're idiots and we're fools for going out to work. Because why don't we all just give up work and live on benefits?
They present the idea of a benefits culture and a benefits lifestyle, as if people on benefits are choosing to be there. And that language, that derogatory language, feeds into casual contempt for the poor.
Of course Kelly's going to be comfortable in the benefit system because she's got all this money coming in.
What we see is programmes like Mick and Margaret, We All Pay Your Benefits, which creates intentionally and very clearly a division between the idea of taxpayers and benefit recipients as enemies.
Britons have been fed stories about the flaws in their social benefit system for years. The tabloids were the first to discover the audiences for such stories, and by 2013, TV producers were tapping into that same market. The BBC's We All Pay Your Benefits came first. Similar offerings followed on other channels. Along with millions of viewers, the programmes attracted plenty of criticism for the exploitation of people's hardship, what has come to be known as poverty porn.
The term poverty porn is a pretty accurate reflection on this idea of watching poor people for entertainment and reading about poor people in newspapers when it's for entertainment as opposed to an actual insight into these people's lives.
I'd be quite offended if people thought that Benefits Britain was poverty porn, because Benefits Britain told the stories of people who lived their lives with limited resources.
The new beef stock pot.
There's no reason why you shouldn't tell their story. If you're putting programmes out about people whose lives depend on benefits and who live in poverty, and those programmes rate well, then programme makers will just continue to make those programmes.
And that's exactly it. These programmes rate well. But do they actually portray reality? Take the benefits cheat trope. In the 2015-16 tax year, fraudulent benefits claims cost the British state £1.9 billion. The cost of tax evasion that year, £5.2 billion. Add into the mix tax avoidance at £1.7 billion, and you're at almost 4 times the cost of benefit fraud. And that doesn't begin to include wealthy Britons hiding their assets offshore or tax loss to the shadow economy. But the media, especially the tabloid press, disproportionately choose to direct our attention and outrage to the former, leaving high-income fraudsters, who are less telegenic and harder to find, in the shadows.
I would love to see, the flip side of that, and a television show about tax avoiders, that people are rinsing the system and dodging tax and so forth. The hypocrisy surrounding what they choose to put on TV screens, it will always target the most vulnerable.
As a programme maker, you always choose the best stories, the characters who will make the best television. In one case, we filmed with some Romanian roamers who'd come to the UK to claim benefits, often fraudulently, then took British benefits back to Romania and built themselves a home.
I'm gonna take benefit from England, yeah? England is one country with much money.
We shouldn't shy away from stories that are true stories just because they are sensational or the contributors are outrageous in some way.
Thank you so much, England.
So long as the context is there, then that should be fine.
The really key areas of misrepresentation are around the day-to-day lives of people in receipt of out-of-work benefits, and how far that's kind of characterised by maybe idleness and inactivity and kind of active choosing to be on benefits. People routinely are really trying very hard to get into paid work when and where that's like a realistic option.
The British welfare state, the provision of education, childcare, health and homes, came about after the Second World War, designed to ensure a good standard of living from the cradle to the grave. While popular at the outset, by the late 1970s, much of the rhetoric from politicians and the press was anti-welfare. Social security was depicted as a burden on the state, not a citizen's right. The explosion of reality TV programmes about benefits has only made this image worse.
Some benefits claimants have been transformed by these programs into celebrities, media stars, and a mini-industry has since grown around them. Take Barry Tomes, a PR agent who saw an opportunity in the new genre and took it. He has a book of clients who are on benefits, and he says when journalists and TV producers need help with some kind of benefit story, they call him. His clients can be offered anywhere between £150 to £25,000 for a story, and Barry takes a cut. He also told us that misrepresentation is a big part of the game.
Any story that looks like a benefit recipient is spending big money. That's the key. So just take one of our clients, Marie Buchan's a good example. Marie Buchan hadn't been in the press for a while and she wanted a horse. I said, people are going to go nuclear about you having a horse.
A lot of people watching Marie, I know will be saying, you've got 8 children, why on earth would you want to have a horse that's going to cost you so much money? Why
Everybody comes to the conclusion that a horse must cost thousands of pounds. So actually the facts that were printed were nothing like the truth, but I was happy to run with that because that's what we do. I don't decide if it's fact or fiction, that's for the publisher to decide. As an exclusive...
Some might call it fake news. And this media myth-making has a potentially more detrimental impact on politics. Since the financial crisis 10 years ago, cuts to welfare have been a constant feature of government policy. To sell those policies, politicians often rely on the same kind of stereotypes that TV producers and newspaper publishers do.
What we've got is these programmes that are setting themselves up as journalism, giving Tory politicians more ammunition in order to put through brutal legislation.
If you don't have sanctions, essentially you don't have conditionality and you don't change behaviour.
Tabloid headlines have led to debates in the House of Commons with, for example, George Osborne talking about how taxpayers are subsidising these lifestyles. And this was after the Daily Mail headline, "Vile Product of Welfare UK." It's setting an agenda that the problem is people who exist in poverty, not an economic crisis or not austerity.
Because of people like Marie, that's why we do have to bring a benefits cap in.
In a country where social security cuts are having a real impact on people in need, a media industry has grown, creating its own set of beneficiaries. It is the publishers, producers, PR agents and politicians who reap the benefits. You could call it irresponsible, or, to use a term the media usually reserve for those on benefits, shameless.
And finally, when Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi addresses the nation on his radio program, Mann Ki Baat, he doesn't necessarily stick to politics. On his most recent show, Modi called for a mass movement for a healthier India, urging citizens to make this year's International Yoga Day something special. That provoked some Modi fans to produce a series of animated yoga lessons taught by the Prime Minister himself. Modi has endorsed and tweeted the videos with an enthusiasm that may have something to do with his digitally enhanced, trimmed-down physique. Or that might be a stretch. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
First, stand straight with both your feet at a distance of 2 inches from one another. Now, slowly raise your heels up from the ground and stand on your toes. Stay in this position for about 10 to 15 seconds. Take a deep breath in and slowly raise your arms over your head and join your hands so that your palms touch each other in a namaskar pose.
Take a long, deep breath. And now, exhaling, slowly bend your body towards the right from your hip. Try to touch your right ankle with your right hand and raise your left hand up towards the sky. When you take in long, deep breaths and exhale, it helps you to remain mentally calm, relaxed, and tension-free.